Hello, everybody. Nicholas Snow here. Happy to welcome you to another episode of Life Positive on PromoHomo.TV. Life Positive spotlights people living with, impacted by, or working to bring about the end of HIV and AIDS. And my guest today, many of you know him. His name is David Jax Kelly. All his friends call him Jax. And he's an award-winning LGBTQ community leader and advocate for over 3 decades. And there's many things that he and I can talk about and will talk about because of his unique global perspective in the fight against HIV and AIDS. And I have another show on the network called Higher Powered. And one of the things we do in that show is we take a recovery out of the closet. And Jack is out about being in a recovery program. And so we're going to touch on that topic as well. It's going to be very exciting, and it's all coming up next. PromoHomo.TV is all about empowering you, our communities, and our world. For their support of PromoHomo.TV, I wish to thank my sponsors, DAP Health. I've been a grateful client of DAP Health for more than a decade. One of their value statements, we welcome all people, period. Willie's Modern Fare, 1501 Uptown Gastropub, and 849 Restaurant and Lounge. 3 restaurants, unlimited flavors. Shouting out to my media partners. Pink Media, amplifying PromoHomo.TV across the Twitterverse with their hashtag I Love Gay campaign. David Perry and Associates, a PR and marketing firm. GayDesertGuide.LGBT. And KGay 1065 Palm Springs, available worldwide. Ask your smart speaker to play KGAY. And last but not least, the PromoHomo.TV superstars who voluntarily subscribe to the free content at PromoHomo.TV for as little as $1 a month. Join them at patreon.com/PromoHomo.TV. Meet many of them at PromoHomo.TV/superstars. Now here's how you can step up to the plate. To find out how you can help me empower you, our communities, and our world, visit PromoHomo.TV/empower. Thank you. And we're live, by the way. If you're watching live and you have a comment or question, I can feature it on the screen. Lance Druckerman says, welcome to me and to Jax and to everybody watching. He is, along with his husband, an associate producer of my show, and I really appreciate him. So, David Jax Kelly, JD, MPH, MBA. You know how someone's being introduced and they're standing there when you're saying all of these wonderful things about them? Well, I leave my guests in the green room so they don't have to be embarrassed, but I really want you to know some of their biographical material because it's important. It informs our interview. So, Jax is a Palm Springs resident since 2014 and recently honored by Greater Palm Springs Pride and Brothers of the Desert. He thrives as a leader of community nonprofit organizations. Having stepped down from 3 years of leadership of a $2 million endowment as Treasurer and Trustee of the Palm Springs Public Library Board to attend online classes at USC, Jax, congratulations, completed his Master of Public Health degree in Health Services and Policy in 2022, while continuing his leadership as president since 2019 of Let's Kick Ass Palm Springs, which is a 501c3 organization engaged in social, educational, and advocacy activities for witnesses to the HIV/AIDS plague years. With degrees from Fordham University School of Law and NYU Stern School of Business, Jax has often relied on his legal and financial knowledge to benefit his leadership of LGBT nonprofit organizations, Plus, he's an all around very nice guy. Let me welcome to the show Jax Kelly. Hi, Jax.
Hi, Nicholas. Happy Pride.
Yes, ultimately it's a happy pride, but it's a very scary pride. I mean, never before have we seen such, well, not in a long time have we seen such hate and vitriol directed at our communities. I feel like I'm getting beat up.
Yeah, there's really not too many great news things. I remember a couple of years ago when we were all celebrating gay marriage at the Supreme Court, and we were like saying, "Yay!" Right? And it's like the Supreme Court gives us, reverses Roe v. Wade, and we're like, "Where? What happens?" We're like in these dark ages again. So, yeah.
Well, one of the things that you do is, I have never heard "Let's Kick Ass" described as being for witnesses to the HIV/AIDS plague years. It focuses on long-term survivors of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but that's exactly what we were. We were witnesses to the HIV/AIDS plague years.
Absolutely. And it's so funny because, when I joined the organization back, I guess when I was, before I became president, about 2016 or so, and I was looking at the membership and I was like, wow, we are people who remembered those days. And AIDS survivor syndrome is really about that kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome that people who were witnesses to the plague years experienced. And it's a way of being a little bit more inclusive because we don't want to just say that HIV positive people are welcome. We want to say that people who are really experience that, so they could be caregivers, people who are negative, people who lost loved ones during that period of time, really can relate to our members.
When did you first come to know of what would be called HIV and AIDS?
Well, sometimes just like that movie, I think the past is a story we tell ourselves. A great line. I think it was from Her or something like that. But it's been so long, but I do remember the first time that we do mark, long-term survivors AIDS Day, which is June 5th. Is really marked because of the day that the CDC announced that there was this mysterious disease that was affecting gay men. So, and it was shortly after that, in July of 1981, that the New York Times wrote an article and had a headline about that as well. So, I kind of like thinking, I was a freshman at Yale then, was finishing up my freshman year, and I was like thinking about that. And it kind of, I think, I wasn't out back as a freshman in college, but I had certainly had gay sex, and it was shocking to me because to me, gay sex was safe sex, right? I mean, I wasn't about to get anybody pregnant. So I just thought this is not good. And as the years rolled by, it well, we could go on for days about this, but it was really just that. It was just a horrific situation. And really, I think young people people like me who were young back in those days, that euphoria that you get from being out and gay was really just kind of like slammed shut. Yeah. So we went through trauma, and we come to a place now, I think, where we kind of, we're sighing, and I think I look at youth today and say, there's opportunities to protect yourself and to live that life that maybe I couldn't have lived when in my 20s and 30s. But thank God I'm still here, and that's being a survivor. It's a big deal, and a group like Let's Kick Ass Palm Springs lifts that up. And we certainly did that recently. June 5th, we had our long-term survivors awareness day dinner, and we did it over at United Methodist Church of Palm Springs in their fellowship hall, and we had about 50 to 60 people there, and we had served dinner, and we had great speakers, and among them was Paul Edmonds, who was the fifth person who was cured of HIV/AIDS. And it was a great moment to just reflect and actually really set the stage for for next year because we'll be celebrating our 10th anniversary next year.
Well, that's beautiful. I was invited to that event, but I had committed to going live on almost every day in Pride Month and was previously scheduled to be live with someone. And right now, Let's Kick Ass is having a Chinese food social. They're all eating Chinese food from Wang, so I hope they have some orange chicken for me. So, because you are so out about your own story, talk about the fear you went through when HIV and AIDS showed up and how it came to impact you personally.
Yeah, well, I think you have to put, for me, it's the context of the time. So in 1981, for me, I was going through, going through undergraduate college, and people, it was really shocking to be at Yale back in those days because you think of it as being such a liberal institution, but it was the beginning of the Reagan era. And I think most of my colleagues at Yale were really gung-ho about Ronald Reagan. I remember being a part of the political union, and there was five different groups along the spectrum, going from liberal to ultra-conservative, right? And then there was a centrist group. There was nobody in the ultra-liberal group. There was a few folks who were in the moderate group. Most people were in the centrist group or in the right-wing group. I mean, it was shocking to me. So, so when there was, the Anita Bryants of the world, who was that person who just passed away recently? I mean, these
Pat Robertson.
Pat Robertson, all of those guys were, right along there with Reagan, getting a lot of press. And it wasn't surprising that when the homophobia and the AIDS phobia that was created back then, that said that this disease was brought upon gays by themselves and their activities, their sexual activities. It's horrible. We're trying to be self-affirming people, and people who, to live, in your 20s, when you're thinking that your whole life is ahead of you and you're fearful of a disease, you hear the hate that's out there. It was not a good time. And I soldiered on. I was an economics and political science major, and I was interested, like the rest of my yuppie colleagues at Yale, to actually go off to Wall Street for a while, which I did. I actually got a job in banking, and I stayed there in Manhattan for 15 years. And during that period of time, I started thinking this is a great time to be out. I was in New York. There were things going on like ACT UP and Out Week, and I think a lot of great writing and social activities. Keith Haring. I mean, there was just so much going on, I think, in the 80s in New York that was so representative of a strong gay activism. And that wasn't a really great place to be, I think, for gay men in Wall Street in particular. It was a very stultifying place, and to come out and my job was a little daring, but I did it. And one of the first steps that I did in doing it was to actually get training from the United Way to be a board member for a not-for-profit. And I asked the United Way to assign me to an AIDS organization, and they did, which was the Upper Room AIDS Ministry, which eventually became Harlem United, which is a big FQHC up in Harlem. But back in the day, in 1991, we didn't have tests, really reliable tests for HIV. The people that we knew who were HIV positive we were serving mostly homeless people who had TB and other infectious diseases. We were finding them housing. We were trying to get them fed. We had a kitchen. We were working in the basement of a Harlem church. It was exciting times, and those were times when I was negative and I was living with a partner who was positive. And so back in '91, AIDS was still a death sentence, and it kind of, I, the funny thing, I was just talking to my husband, Clayton Coppice, who is writing a history of HIV/AIDS in America right now, and I was like thinking, did I really ever think that I was going to become an AIDS widow? And I think my partner at the time just looked so darn healthy. I just never thought about it so much. And he's still with us today. I mean, he made it to the point where, when the cocktail came out in the mid '90s, that he was able to take it, and it took. That was a good situation. I myself did not seroconvert until 2006, and it was kind of like, to me, I think it was a what a lesson, because I hadn't tested in a number of years. Maybe I got overconfident or something, but I got this.
Excuse me, there's something bouncing on your desk. I don't know if you're playing with
Oh,
something, but
no, thank
there's.
you for letting me know, because
You're
sometimes I
welcome.
talk with my hands and
You were, yes, you were tapping, and it was amplifying. You were making your point.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So anyway, so in 2006, I actually had a very bad cough that lasted for a number of weeks, and I felt weaker and weaker. And eventually, my partner said, "Let's go to a doctor." And they did an X-ray, and I found out I had pneumonia. They checked me into Cedars-Sinai, and then they gave me my HIV diagnosis. I had 44 T cells. I was really, really sick. But the medications were great. I mean, I was able to knock out the pneumonia pretty quickly. It took me weeks and weeks to actually physically feel strong again. But it's a place where if you ever get to that point in your life where you realize you're no longer you're no longer invulnerable, and you really have to pay attention to what your body is telling you, and maybe there's something good about having to sit in a hospital all by yourself for a while and think about where your life is going. And I think it was probably from that moment on, especially when I had started immersing myself into HIV volunteer work, that I just said, you know what, I really need to stay in this space. And it was kind of weird for me, because my parents, I think, were people who they both were very educated. They both had master's degrees. They were teachers. One was a college professor. I always said that I wasn't going into that profession, and it turned out that when my father was a social worker, the work I'm doing now is really social work. A lot of times when I get in front of people and do presentations, it's teaching. So it's maybe, it's kind of like stay in your lane with what your family presents. I don't know, maybe.
One of the things that, well, thank you for all that you do. One of the things that you and I have in common is early involvement in the fight against HIV and AIDS, coming out in the early 80s. But I didn't become HIV positive until 2007, which is what you're using the term seroconvert, and that's what that means, becoming HIV positive. And I had a rare slip in my safer sex behavior and didn't use a condom. They didn't use a condom, but I was a participant in that decision. They said and believed they were HIV negative, and they weren't. And I ended up with a severe flu-like illness and ended up becoming HIV positive. And I had such mixed emotions about that, because decades into the HIV/AIDS pandemic, completely armed with the knowledge to protect myself, I didn't. And in retrospect, though, I learned, well, a lot of my decisions were stemming from isolation and loneliness and depression. And even if I had none of those things going on, just in a passionate human moment, I could have made the same decision. So, so you and I, in our own ways, did ultimately connect to the worldwide fight against HIV and AIDS, which is how we met.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it was back when, shout out to Sunny Roseberger and the Life Group LA. So I remember when I first showed up there, and I've said this to Sunny in the group, I felt
For
like I
people
was,
that don't know about the Life Group LA, let's let them know.
oh, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, the Life Group, all right, the Life Group LA has been around for a long time. Sonny Roseberger is one of the key people behind it. And the whole premise is to basically empower people whose lives are impacted by HIV and AIDS. And that doesn't mean you're living with it, you're impacted by.
Mhm.
And it basically is about empowering people. It was always free, and lunch was always provided, and it was generally 2 days. And people that met each other there have an agreement not to talk about knowing each other there, so it's a very safe and sacred space. And has the work of Sunny has brought many people together, and you and I are examples of that. As is another friend of mine who will not mind me saying his name. Simeon Den is someone that I met because of his volunteerism with the Life Group LA.
Yeah, and another shout out to Brian Risley from APLA. I think he was the one who told me about the Life Group weekend. So, yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of connections, and they go back years. It's great to get back together with some of these folks and have many reunions. Um, yeah,
Well, Lance is watching. He shares he's been HIV positive since August of '96. He's never been on medication. He's listed as an elite controller non progressor. He's lost many friends in those early years. And I know that you've been around enough to know what an elite controller non progressor is, but he's a walking miracle. And he says to you and I that he's glad that we're both still here. Yes, I'm so glad that you're still here. Now, one of the things that I would like you to talk about is the inequity in care and in healthcare as it relates to people of color, and why, for example, black and brown men are at much greater risk of HIV and have been more severely impacted by HIV and AIDS. Now, what I've asked you to answer could be a semester or a graduate thesis, but in general, I would love for you to just speak to that as a black man.
yeah. Well, I'll start out by giving another shout out to the Brothers of the Desert, because recently Let's Kick Ass and Brothers of the Desert were awarded a grant from a group called BEAM. That's like a balance beam. It stands for Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective. And what we're given the grant to do is to form a discussion group, much like LCAPS has done for it's called the LCAPS Roundtable. But this discussion group is specifically for Black gay men who are aging with HIV. So it's kind of like and it's interesting to talk about that here in this context in the Coachella Valley, because the group that I lead, LCAPS, does have Black and brown members, but the organization is predominantly white. And I know from having sat in on some of our discussion groups that the attendance by Black and brown people is small. And I think part of it is because of the different experiences of Black and brown people in HIV over the years. And, I think from my experience in New York, I started off with a organization that was based in Harlem, and that was very different than what was going on at GMHC down in the West Village in New York. So when you have those kind of parallel tracks going on at the same time, people who are in those different situations are going to have different lived experiences. And I think to have Black and brown people who may not have been going downtown for their healthcare, like in my New York example, but staying uptown, the stories that they might share in a discussion group are going to sound different than the ones that might have been with the downtown group. So in recognition of that, I think that that's one of the reasons why we want to, lift up this group that we're going to be forming between LCAPS and Brothers of the Desert. But to go back to this, your graduate school question, because obviously it's something that when I was taking my master's in public health at USC, a number of classes touched on this disparities of health and the ideas that sometimes our environment that we live in impacts, the healthcare that we get. And I'll try to give you a brief example that I think kind of illustrates this. But I was doing my practicum work in Ohio last year, in Cleveland, Ohio, and one of their where I was staying or living in Cleveland was an area called University Circle, and one of the major parts of University Circle, besides Case Western Reserve University, which is probably the reason why it's called University Circle, is also that they've got this major hospital there called the Cleveland Clinic. And the Cleveland Clinic is one of the
Very
premier
famous
hospitals in the world. But it also happens to be, kind of smack in the middle of two predominantly Black neighborhoods. And they did one of the benefits of the Obamacare was that it mandated that large hospital centers have to examine, do reports about the communities that they live in and how they interact with their community. And in this report, they actually identified the fact that the Black and brown communities that are their neighbors often think of that hospital as a fortress, and it's not welcoming, and it's not a place where they feel that even if they can walk there, that it's a place that they're going to really be interested in being at. And then if you look at the statistics about the health of these Black and brown folks, where the life expectancy for them is like 60, but if you go to a neighboring adjacent neighborhood that's predominantly white and their life expectancy is 80, it's like you're like within walking distance of each other. Why is it 80 here and 60 here? Sometimes in this report, they actually talked about some issues like a food desert. Sometimes Black and brown neighborhoods don't have really good supermarkets in them. They don't have really good emergency care, facilities that are, separated, for example, from a hospital or urgent care facilities. So for them to actually access healthcare or to actually find good and healthy foods, they might have to go quite a distance. And instead, maybe they'll just go to the bodega that's down the street that serves, that not only has a lot of kind of fast foods and snack foods, but also serves beer and wine. So there are these disparities in health, and then one of the things that we learned, I think, in during COVID, but I think we actually did a little bit of work towards, I mean, something I remember studying about in my classes, is the idea that healthcare for Black and brown folks, there's a certain disconnectedness to the healthcare community. So you and I know that in our HIV care, one of the things that we do is we actually see a doctor at least more than once a year, sometimes two
I
or three
see.
times.
I see a doctor every 3 months for my
Right,
HIV
right.
care.
Right. So once you get into that, regular going to a doctor, you get through all those issues you might have had even as a youth. I don't know about you, but I was not going to a
I
doctor
think you're bouncing
2 times.
something again.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you.
That's
I don't know
okay.
about you, but I don't know if you were, going to a doctor 2 or 3 times a year.
No, once a year
So,
I would have a
and you might have
physical.
been a little resentful about having to show up, and you were kind of getting used to being in a waiting room and looking around and seeing how you fit in with this group. And so all of those things, there's a lot of, just going from the waiting room to the doctor's office, some barriers that people who are colored oftentimes encounter that makes them wary. There's been a lot of medical mistrust because of historically things that have happened to Black people in the healthcare system that have,
Like using black people as guinea pigs on experimental drugs
right,
and
right,
diseases.
and diseases, right. So those resonate. Those stories stay in the community, and so when you get something like COVID coming along, you wonder, how do we reach people who are Black and brown, and encouraging them to get vaccinated. And there were some very innovative ways of doing that. I mean, in terms of going to maybe the supermarkets where they shop, and to use community leaders to speak to them about the importance of getting vaccinated, or to go to our beauty shops and our barber shops and have our barbers and our beauticians actually have brochures or information about vaccination for COVID. So there's some ways that we can bridge that gap. I think that's the important thing, is to actually be out there in the community and doing it. I think that's why our project with between LCAPS and Brothers of the Desert is so important, because we're really going to try to dig down into the community and help our Black brothers who are aging with HIV be able to express themselves in a safe space, and talk about what it is like to age with HIV.
Well, that work sounds great. I want to I put these on the screen before, but brothersofthedesert.org is the website that you go to for this amazing organization, of which I consider myself an ally. And they're basically all about empowering Black gay men and their allies, and so many activities are going on. Including an amazing, they're involved in at least 2 significant Juneteenth celebrations later this month in the Palm Springs area. One of them at the Mizell Center, and another one is a family reunion for Black LGBTQ community members here locally. So brothersofthedesert.org for that. And Let's Kick Ass Palm Springs is LKAPS.org. And they're always having consistent opportunities to connect. They have an active group, great volunteers, and also a newsletter that keeps you engaged if you choose to. So one of the things that I wanted you to talk about as well, I knew you and I would not run out of things to talk about, and I also know you're going to a baseball game. You're in San Diego right now. What game are you going to, and what team are you rooting for?
Well, my husband was a professor at Oberlin College for 40 years. And when I met him, he told me that he was a Cleveland Guardians fan. So I was just like, oh my God, the last time I was in Cleveland was for the World Series in '95 to actually watch them. And I froze my patukas off. So I was like, having lived in the desert in Southern California for as many years as I have, I was just not like, oh, I'm dating a man from a cold state. This is not good. So I had to get over that, and actually now I've become a bit of a Cleveland Guardians fan. So the Padres are playing the Guardians tonight.
Okay, then. Well, may the best team win. Lance says, thank you for this interview and for being so open. Regarding disparities, I like to point out, not to you, you don't need me to point this out to you. I like to point out to myself and to other people that might relate the notion of privilege. So there is white privilege, and that, again, takes years to wrap your head around when you're willing. But also, as Americans, we have privileges. And for some of us in many communities, living with HIV has become somewhat incidental. And and also we have access to things like PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's a pill, or now shots, where someone who's HIV negative can be on PrEP, and when following the course of treatment correctly, it's scientifically impossible for them to get HIV. And then we also have undetectable. So I'm living with HIV. I have an undetectable viral load. So it is scientifically impossible for me to transmit HIV during sex. We have education. I just lost one of my AirPods. Oh, here it is. We have education about all of this, and we have access to it in many communities throughout the U.S. But you have been to worldwide conferences looking at the fight against HIV and AIDS. And I was wondering if you could just talk about the disparities of access to treatment and how HIV and AIDS are still huge issues in many parts of the world.
Yeah, until recently, I was a member of the Community Scientific Subcommittee of the AIDS Clinical Trials Group, and they're meeting in Washington this week. And most of our members of this group, I'll call CSS, were from African countries. And it was so interesting to be a part of that group to understand how HIV/AIDS is being addressed there. I think one of the more moving stories for me was that, you might remember the old days where there were some medications that had to be refrigerated. And some of the technology and some of the access to medications that happen in Africa, we've kind of evolved. So we're taking we're taking pills mostly that are, you don't need to refrigerate any longer. But I was hearing stories about people who were being given like a 3-month supply of medications in Africa that were needed to be refrigerated. They were packed in ice. And by the time that they got back to wherever they lived, the ice had melted, the packs were gone, and then they were facing electrical outages. So I was just like, how do you deal with that? Yeah, so we've done an amazing thing. I mean, the PEPFAR in the United States, the commitment to fund AIDS programs globally has been a real benefit to keeping the virus somewhat under check. It's a different demographic in foreign countries than it is for the United States. But one thing that we do have in common is that it seems to be Black and brown people again, people of color who are people who are actually being more impacted by the disease than others. So it's not the same to talk about the Black and brown experience here in this country than it is with the experience of people of color in other countries. But when you're kind of doing it on a helicopter basis and you're looking at it from way up above, you kind of say, there's something similar going on here. I just can't put my finger on it, but something seems to be going on wrong. And it could be, back to what you were talking about, this whole concept of privilege, right? So we're talking about third world countries. We're talking about people who don't have great incomes, don't have access to things that we oftentimes take for granted here in the United States. So, there are a lot of issues to go through when you're making those comparisons.
Well, I want to thank you for who you are in the world, for the life that you're living. I'm grateful that you found a lot of joy and happiness and fulfillment in your personal and professional life. That's really cool. I have a remaining sort of serious topic to bring up, but before I do that, is there anything else you would like to share that we haven't talked about?
Well, yes, thank you. One thing I did want to bring up is I do serve on something called the California Planning Group, which is a community advisory board to the Office of AIDS of the California Department of Health. And they are doing a free virtual symposium at the end of June, June 22nd, 23rd, 29th, and 30th from 9 to 1 p.m. It's an opportunity for people who are in the Ending the Epidemics movement here in California to share best practices and innovations in serving community most impacted by this endemic of HIV, HCV, and STIs. And I just want to give you the link has so many letters and numbers, it's ridiculous, but I am on Twitter, and I just posted the information on Twitter's. My Twitter account is David Jax Kelly 1, the number 1. So David Jax Kelly 1. If you go to Twitter and look it up, there'll be a link there to this symposium. You can register and get more information.
Is that correct?
Yes, you did it great. Thank you.
Well, good, because I accidentally posted it to Facebook and to YouTube, but it's on the screen as well. So David Jax Kelly 1 on Twitter is where you can find out about that. That's so important. Anything else?
Yeah, I also wanted to thank a couple of our grantors. Besides Beam, which just recently gave us that grant for the Black HIV men's group discussion group, but we've also been a great beneficiary of a group called Richmond Ermit Aid Foundation, which oftentimes is called REEF. They've been doing for years. They've been doing fundraisers for not-for-profits in San Francisco, and last year they came to Palm Springs, and we were a beneficiary. Last year actually 2 years ago at Pride, we got another grant from them. This past year at Pride, this year's grant, we're going to be doing a probably more than one, but definitely one bus trip. We did a bus trip last year. We're going to do another bus trip this year. The one that we did last year was to Idlewild. And so for our members, we just went out to Idlewild Pride for the day, and it was great fun. So we're going to do we're going to do that again, but we're going to do something else too with this REEF Foundation money. And then also the PhRMA, which is the Trade Association for the Pharmaceutical Industry, gave us a grant. So that went towards our dinner that we had for HIV Long-Term Survivors Awareness Day.
Fantastic. That's really, really cool. Well, I put Let's Kick-Ass Palm Springs address on the screen again while you were saying all that. So the final thing I wanted to talk about is that, unfortunately, stigma directed at those of us living with HIV is still really, really prevalent, especially within the gay male community. I've experienced it so many times. I'm generally open about my HIV status in on apps and in places where one would post for hookups or connection. And there's a huge difference between the responses I get when I don't mention my HIV status versus the responses I get when I'm out about being someone that's living with HIV. And I have consistent experiences where I get responses when I keep that a secret, but always in the first or second message back, I share that information and, goodbye, So I realize I need to expand where I'm going to meet people. So I get that that's one of the solutions, but I'm looking forward to the knowledge that U equals U becoming much greater, and people really understanding that you don't have to be afraid of being sexually active with someone who's living with HIV.
Yeah. It's really interesting you mentioned that, because it brings up another word for me, which is intersectionality, right? Which is how sometimes our identity runs into similar but different aspects. And when you were talking about the HIV stigma, it reminded me that the times when I was wondering how people react to me when they find out that I'm gay, or when they realize that I'm Black, or, so it's, and the biggest thing for me these days, because of our HIV, because of the fact that 50% of the people who are living with HIV these days are over the age of 50, and that number is growing. And it's mostly, thank God, because of the medications, we're all doing much better, we're living longer lives. But the one thing that I don't think that people who are aging with HIV expected to run into is the concept of ageism. So we've got this one other thing that we're kind of getting into these days, and And some of it is internalized. I mean, we talk about, internalized homophobia a lot, and how it was difficult for us to come out of the closet, and the hate and shame that our families put on us for being gay people. And so we kind of broke down those own barriers for ourselves. But the one barrier that we're not taught to break down is internalized ageism. And I think this hits our gay community pretty hard, because I think we're very much a youth culture. And so if we as gay aging people can't embrace our own aging, we are actually going to be experiencing internalized ageism. And so, and then the other part of it is just, what about the ageism that you experience from other people? Are you comfortable going to a senior center, even though you're over the age of 60, right? I mean, LCAPS, it does a lot of things for people in our community, but we're not a full service organization. So there are times when I have to make referrals to other people. And one of the referrals I might make is to a senior center, right? We're getting away from calling them senior centers. We're calling them centers for older persons. But just out of, just making it a little simpler for me, I'm just going to call it a senior center. I've had experiences where aging LGBTQ people, when presented with the idea of going to a place for older persons, they're like kind of shocked. They're taken aback, and it's like, yeah. And then what happens is they wonder, well, will I be welcome there? What if they find out that I'm HIV positive, or I'm gay, or I'm Black? What does that mean? And all those fears, all that energy that we thought we had gotten rid of, that we were free of, all of a sudden comes back because of the fact that we've gotten older. So that's one of my things these days.
Well, part of that conversation is that we're in denial that we've become seniors. It's like, I'm 61. What are you talking about? I don't need to go to a senior center. But no, I'm aware of my aging, but I'm grateful to be here to age. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, and we don't have to wait several years for you to come back on the show. I'm glad that we finally made this happen. I really wanted to spotlight you and your work and your insights for quite a while. So, are you going to dinner before the game?
Oh, are you kidding? I hear that they've got these really good tri-tip nachos at the Petco Stadium. So I've looked at the menu. I know where I want to go.
Okay, well, enjoy your baseball food, and may your team win. And I look forward to seeing you when you're back here in the desert.
Thanks for having me, Nicholas.
You're welcome. And for all of you at home, on behalf of Jax and myself, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.
In a safe place, I got room to breathe. Been a long chase, but at last I'm free. These open woods, I knew I could find peace here. Nothing like the city where I got tired of the running, the catching up. I got hungry for the stunning high mountain tops. Some plans, some dreams to catch, to promised lands, to find my path, see the planet from hungry for the sun in high mountain top.